On the night of August 25th, 1931, the dikes around the city of Gaoyou in eastern China gave way. Most of the city's buildings were a single story tall. There was nowhere to go up. The water came in the dark, fast and without warning, and by some estimates, between 10,000 and 15,000 people drowned before morning. In a single night, in a single city, in a disaster that was already 5 months old. This is the story of the 1931 China floods. The event, documented in the 2023 Journal of Climate, is responsible for more than 2 million deaths and cited by historians and disaster researchers as the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history. A disaster so large, so prolonged, and so catastrophically managed that its full scale was never precisely counted, because the institutions that might have counted it were themselves collapsing under the weight of what was happening. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what China's rivers had been doing for 3 years before the water came. Between 1928 and 1930, central China was in a drought. 3 years of below-normal rainfall had left the soil hard, cracked, and moisture-starved. The drought had been severe enough to cause food shortages and economic distress across a region that was already under strain from civil war. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek was fighting both the Chinese Communist Party and regional warlords simultaneously. The country was politically fragmented, militarily overstretched, and financially weak. It was, in every meaningful sense, in no condition to withstand what was coming. The winter of 1930 was exceptionally harsh. Snowpack and ice accumulated to unusual depths in the mountains surrounding the Yangtze, Yellow, and Huai River basins, 3 of the largest river systems in China, all draining into the same densely populated central plain. When that snowpack began melting in early 1931, the meltwater flowed downstream into rivers already carrying more water than normal. By spring, the water levels in the major river systems were running high before a drop of seasonal rain had fallen. Then the rain fell. In April 1931, far above average rainfall hit the river basins. The soil, drought-hardened for 3 years, could not absorb it. The water ran off the surface and directly into already swollen rivers. The rivers rose higher. The dike systems that had been built and rebuilt over centuries to contain them were under pressure by April. Then in late June and July, the monsoon rains arrived. Not normally unusual for the season, but this year on top of what was already there, on top of rivers already near the limits of their banks. Areas along the Yangtze River reported more than 600 millimeters of rain in June alone. The river's water level reached its highest point since reliable record-keeping had begun. By the end of July, the scale of what was happening had become visible from the outside. A lake, roughly 900 miles long and 40 miles wide, had engulfed central China. Not a river in flood. A lake. A temporary inland sea covering farmland, roads, villages, towns, and parts of major cities across 8 provinces: Anhui, Hubei, Hunan, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Jiangxi, Henan, and Shandong. On August 1st, 1931, the dike protecting Hankow, part of the Tri-City metropolitan area of Wuhan, then is now one of China's most important industrial centers, gave way. The eyewitness account left by Jin Shilong, a senior engineer at the Hubei Flood Prevention Agency, describes what happened in real terms that no statistic can match. I was just coming off duty at the company's main office, a fairly new 3-story building near the center of town, he wrote. When I heard the terrible noise and saw the wall of water coming, I raced to the top story of the building. A wall of water, visible, moving toward him. He made it. Many of his neighbors did not. Approximately 5,000 people drowned in Hankow almost immediately when the dike failed. Some streets were under 9 feet of water, others were under 20. Most of Wuhan's residential buildings in 1931 were single-story structures. For the tens of thousands of families in those buildings, when the dike failed, there was no upper floor to race to. There was no escape. They died in their homes, in the streets, or in the water, depending on where they were and how fast the water moved in their specific location. The water stood in Wuhan for nearly 3 months. To understand the physical scale of what this looked like from above, consider the measurement that historians and geographers have settled on to describe the inundated territory, approximately 180,000 square kilometers. That is roughly the combined area of England and half of Scotland. An entire English-speaking nation's worth of territory underwater. And it was not empty territory. This was one of the most densely populated agricultural regions on Earth. The Yangtze River Basin that had been supporting hundreds of millions of people for thousands of years, the heartland of Chinese civilization, the source of the rice that fed a significant fraction of the world's population. Every village, every road, every granary, every field in that area was either submerged or surrounded. The 500,000 people driven from their homes in the first days of August were a fraction of the total displacement. The final count of people affected, 25 million by the government's own contemporary estimate, as many as 53 million by some historians' later calculations, represents a number so large it resists comparison. 100 miles to the east, the city of Nanjing, then the capital of the Republic of China, found itself underwater for 6 weeks. The government that was supposed to be managing the disaster was watching its own capital flood. And then the night of August 25th came. The dikes around Lake Gaoyou in Jiangsu province had been holding the backed-up waters of the Grand Canal. On the night of the 25th, the water found a weakness. The dikes gave way in the dark. The historian Chris Courtney, whose 2018 book, The Nature of Disaster in China, is the definitive English language account of the event, described what happened. Estimates of between 10,000 and 15,000 people drowned that night in Gaoyou alone. The city was, as described above, largely single-story. The water came at night. The numbers are necessarily estimates because there was no one counting. The survivors were struggling to survive, and the dead were underwater. The immediate drowning deaths, the people who died in the water in their homes, swept away by the current, represented only a fraction of what was coming. The University of Nanking conducted a field survey in the immediate aftermath, led by agricultural economist John Lossing Buck, and estimated that at least 150,000 people had drowned in the first 100 days of the flood. That number was confirmed by the official National Flood Relief Commission report of 1933, which also cited it as the direct drowning toll. The Commission's total death estimate, including all causes, was over 2 million people. The range cited in modern sources runs from approximately 422,000 at the low end to 4 million at the high end, depending on how deaths from the secondary causes were counted and over what time period. The secondary causes were, in many ways, worse than the water itself. The rice harvest of 1931 was not destroyed by the flood in the sense of being washed away. It was destroyed by being submerged at exactly the wrong moment. Rice fields in central China were underwater when the crops should have been ripening and being harvested. There was no harvest. The grain reserves stored in warehouses and granaries in low-lying areas were flooded and spoiled. 8.5 million acres of farmland were inundated. The millions of people who lived at subsistence level and depended entirely on that harvest had nothing. They ate what they could find, then they starved. The disease came at the same time, Millions of survivors crowded onto dikes, railway embankments, rooftops, and patches of higher ground, any land above the water. These camps had no clean water, no sanitation, no drainage, no waste disposal. The floodwater surrounding them was a mixture of the Yangtze River and the contents of every latrine, pig pen, and waste pit in the inundated territory. Refugees who drank from it contracted typhoid. Dysentery spread through the camps with nothing to stop it. Measles moved through children who were already weakened by hunger and exposure. Then, in 1932, after the floodwaters had receded and people were trying to return to their homes, cholera arrived, a subsequent epidemic that claimed an additional 32,000 lives in the official count, though again the real number is almost certainly higher. The historian Courtney's description of conditions in Wuhan during the flood conveys what the statistics cannot. The Dragon King Temple at the confluence of the Yangtze and Han rivers in Wuhan, a structure that had served as a focal point of flood prevention prayer and ceremony for at least 200 years, since at least the 1730s, had been torn down the previous year by city authorities conducting a campaign against superstition. Whether you believe in dragons or not, the timing was the kind of detail that people remembered. The Dragon King's temple was gone, and then the Yangtze came for Wuhan. In the refugee camps, witness accounts describe people sleeping on narrow dike walls 500 feet long, densely packed with survivors who had nowhere else to be. Anne Lindbergh, the wife of aviator Charles Lindbergh, traveled through China in September 1931 on a separate journey and flew over the flooded regions, writing a memoir describing what she saw from the air, a horizontal world become vertical, rooftops as islands, the geometry of roads and field boundaries still visible under the water like a map of something that used to exist. The relief effort mounted was enormous by the standards of the era and catastrophically inadequate to the scale of the disaster. The nationalist government established the National Flood Relief Commission under Song Ziwen, a prominent figure in the government, to centralize coordination. The commission brought in foreign experts, epidemiologist Wu Lihanda, to manage the disease response, and hydraulic engineer Oliver Todd to assess the dike damage and plan reconstruction. International aid organizations, including the American Red Cross, contributed resources and personnel. The International Red Cross, the China International Famine Relief Commission, and various missionary organizations also mobilized. In total, the relief effort extended free assistance to nearly 5 million individuals across 269 counties and housed approximately 1 million people in organized camps. The sheer logistics of feeding, housing, and providing medical care to 1 million displaced people in 1931 China, without modern communications infrastructure, without motorized transport across flooded terrain, without adequate medical supplies, required an organizational effort that was, by any honest assessment, heroic. And it was not enough. The camps where 1 million people were housed were the lucky ones. Tens of millions of others survived as they could, on dikes, in boats, on rooftops, in the upper stories of the few buildings that had upper stories, eating whatever they could find while the water stayed for weeks, then months, then the better part of a year in some areas. The dike reconstruction was an extraordinary logistical achievement even within the disaster. By the middle of 1932, more than 2,000 kilometers of embankments had been rebuilt. By some accounts, the largest earthwork project in China since the original construction of the Grand Canal, employing over 1.1 million laborers and completed in approximately 6 months. The work at Gaoyou, where the catastrophic night breach had occurred, was led by hydraulic engineer Wang Shuqiang and a Presbyterian missionary named Lit Harnsberger, and partially funded by a Buddhist hermit who contributed his savings to the reconstruction. That combination, government engineer, Christian missionary, Buddhist monk, working together on the same dike tells you something about the scale of the emergency. Every resource that could be assembled was assembled. It was still not enough. The political consequences of the 1931 floods were slow to arrive, but decisive in their ultimate effect. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek was widely seen as having failed to anticipate, respond to, or adequately manage the disaster. The relief efforts were real, but they were insufficient and visibly insufficient. Millions of people, new people who had died or nearly died, while government officials in Nanjing, which had been flooded itself, tried to coordinate a response across a fractured, war-strained state. The Chinese Communist Party, which had been fighting for survival against nationalist military campaigns throughout this period, explicitly argued that the disaster demonstrated the fundamental incompetence of the existing government. In a country where the Yangtze had flooded countless times over thousands of years, and where an entire philosophical and engineering tradition had built up around flood management, the failure of those systems was not experienced as an act of God. It was experienced as a failure of the people responsible. By 1949, the Communists had won the Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. The connection between the failures of the 1930s, the floods, the famine, the inadequate governance, and the collapse of the nationalist government's popular legitimacy is part of the standard historical account of why the Communist Revolution succeeded. The 1931 China floods are not well known outside China. The event lacks the visual documentation of modern disasters, no satellite imagery, no helicopter footage, no social media. What survives is a small archive of photographs, most of them showing crowds on high ground, boats moving through flooded streets, and the eerie landscape of a city seen from the water level, enough to understand the scale, not enough to feel it the way later generations feel Katrina or the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. But the 2023 Journal of Climate paper, a peer-reviewed scientific study by researchers from multiple institutions, including the University of Pittsburgh, examined the meteorological forcing mechanisms of the flood and confirmed that it was the deadliest flood event on record in world history. The casualties of this event alone, the researchers noted, were nearly equivalent to the global mortality from all natural disasters combined across the 16-year period from 1974 to 1990. A single event. 3 months. At its most conservative, credible estimate, approximately 2 million people. At the estimates produced by the National Flood Relief Commission at the time, the same number. At the higher range cited by various historians studying the secondary mortality from starvation and disease over the following 18 months, potentially twice that. The water in Wuhan stood for 3 months. The water in Nanjing stood for 6 weeks. The water at Lake Gaoyou came in one night and killed 10,000 to 15,000 people before anyone had time to understand what was happening. The dike reconstruction was finished by mid-1932. The cholera epidemic ended later that year. The rice harvest of 1932 grew in fields that had been underwater the year before. Life resumed in the way life resumes, not because things are better, but because the alternative to resuming is not an option. The 1931 China floods are the deadliest natural disaster in recorded history by the consensus of the researchers who study these events. They are largely forgotten outside the country where they happened. The 10,000 people who drowned in Gaoyou on a single night in August have no global memorial, no annual ceremony attended by world leaders, no museum exhibit in the major capitals. What they have is the river. The Yangtze, which flooded again in 1935 and again in 1954 and again in 1998, and which the Chinese government has spent the better part of a century trying to control through a series of engineering interventions culminating in the Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric dam in the world, completed in 2006 and designed in part to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic downstream flooding that killed 2 million people. in 1931. Whether it will be sufficient is a question the river has not yet answered. Subscribe for more, and let us know in the comments which detail from this disaster surprised you most, because this is the deadliest natural disaster in human history, and most people have never heard of it.